introduce our speaker this afternoon, I would like to go around the room with our regular ritual of asking people to identify themselves briefly. If you would, we'd rather like to work around the words retired or emeritus for the simple reason that this is obviously misleading. People that I know keep working harder than ever. So if you would like to say that you have worked for the United States Treasury for 45 years and are now writing a book about the Ringling Barnum Bailey Circus, well, so much the better. I would say for my own part, my research is usually about the Middle East, but as of the 1st of November, we are signing off on a huge book on the history of Oxford University Press that has been some 6 years in the making. Arnita, would you like to?
I'm Arnita Jones. I am currently interim deputy director at the American Education Research Association.
Sandra Herbert, UMBC History Department.
Stanley Brandis, Anthropology Department, University of California, Berkeley.
And I'm Jane Brandis.
Jim Gilbert, History Department, University of Maryland.
Jackson Breyer, University of Maryland English Department, and college friend of John Gillis.
Yes, I'll follow in that vein. James Henretta. John and I were colleagues long time ago, and wanted to see what he had made of his life in the meantime.
Landis Jones, a political scientist trying to be ecumenical.
I'm Molly Sullivan. I'm an undergrad at George Washington University, International Affairs major, studying European and Eurasian affairs.
Alexander Okun, Kennan Institute, Woodrow Wilson Center.
Yakun Hall, visiting junior scholar, Wilson Center.
Don Wolfensberger, senior scholar here at the Wilson Center, working on the mother of all oxymorons, congressional reform.
Liang Song, visiting junior scholar in Wilson Center, focused on Taiwan economy.
Jordan Harms, intern at the Wilson Center.
Brandon Sitzman from the Office of Science and Tech, USAID.
Jim Herbert. I worked for a while at the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation. I am now a pro bono laborer in the vineyard of humanities indicators and endangered languages.
Jim Banner, historian, and like James Henretta, a long time and still colleague of our speaker.
Jan Lamberts, I work at the Research Center of the Holocaust Museum up the road.
Michael Cragen, I head up a climate change adaptation for coastal communities program at EPA.
Gail Schreiner, a fellow here at the Wilson Center for this year and otherwise Department of History at Rutgers University.
I'm Marion Barber, the Associate Director of the National History Center, and I have one request of all of you. If you are new to us or you've never signed in but would like to be on our email address list, please sign in this yellow sheet that's going to go around the table. Thanks so much.
Great. You could join us at the table. Fellows are especially included in our activities. Let me say a word of welcome as well. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center, and delighted to see so many of you for this Washington History seminar that we jointly organize with the National History Center and the AHA. I've been missing in action. As my co-chair, Roger Lewis, probably has said, I've had an enormous amount of travel since the beginning of September. I just got back this weekend from a week in Delhi, and I think there are some other trips for the center that I will be doing. So I'm making a rare cameo appearance here.
Are you real?
But I'm delighted to be back and see so many of you. just a couple of announcements before I introduce our distinguished speaker. To say that the History and Public Policy program is launching starting today, the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you're interested in this most dangerous Cold War crisis, we have a host of events that we're organizing or co-organizing starting today with a major national conversation, the Center's signature event series on the Cuban Missile Crisis with Graham Allison and others. And there's a calendar of events outside, a flyer with all the events. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that today we published online the latest issue of the Cold War International History Project bulletin, the Cold War Project being one of the projects that we run out of the History and Public Policy program here. 800 pages of newly translated and declassified documents from archives around the world, some 20 countries, that really shows the global impact and dynamics of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Finally, I wanted to share a sad news with you. Many of you know already that our longtime Washington History Seminar member and professor of history at American University, Professor Anna Nelson, passed away recently, and we just wanted to acknowledge her contributions to the larger enterprise, but she was also in particular a staunch and steadfast member of this seminar, and so we mourn her passing. We're delighted to have with us one of the profession's greats and a Wilson Center alumnus, John R. Gillis, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Rutgers University, where he still teaches social and cultural history, covering a variety of period subjects and geographical areas. He has a host of books to his credit, too many to mention all of them here, including, of course, A World of Their Own Making, Myth, Ritual, and the Quest for Family Values, 1996, Youth and History, Tradition and Change in European Age Relations, and Islands of the Mind, and the Human Shore, Sea Coasts and History. He has edited a number of books. I just want to mention, since his co-editor is present here, with Jim Banner, Becoming Historians, published in 2009. He served at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in the Social Sciences about 10 years ago. He will talk to us today about the future of American coasts. It's a great pleasure to give John the floor.
Thank you. So do I don't think I need are these things active or not?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here, not in the same place, but back here. I guess that always happens to us at a certain age. We're always back, but never in the same place. No, it's thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this, both the company that we share and all these friends who've shown up. It's tremendous, plus some new faces, which is great as well. Well, I am going to be talking today about the work that I've been doing, well, for about 10 years, ever since I finished Islands of the Mind, which focused on the cultural history of islands. And this is the book, the new book, so new that I don't believe it is anywhere but here at this table right now, The Human Shore, Sea Coasts and History, published by Chicago University Press. And I think there were supposed to be some copies here today, but they haven't shown up. Doesn't matter. I wouldn't have forced you to buy it anyway. But I hope that I can convince you that its subject is important enough to consider it. I should say that I'm now a bi-coastal person. I don't teach at Rutgers anymore, although I have fond memories of all my colleagues there. I now live in Berkeley, California. So I am bi-coastal, and have been now for some 16 years. And this, in addition to the fact that I spend every summer on the coast of Maine on a small island called Gotts Island, makes me, at least in experience terms, an expert on this field. The problem is that the field I'm about to talk about today, the history of coasts and coastal people, is not a field, because nobody's ever done it before in the historical way that I have attempted it. So it's a bit of an experiment, and we'll see how it goes, and I'm eager for your comments. Now, how many of you have ever seen Sea Ranch in California, or even seen a picture of Sea Ranch? Oh, lots of people. This is great. This is great. Well, Sea Ranch sits on California's spectacular Mendocino coast and is known as the finest model of eco-sensitive coastal development probably in the world. The Berkeley architect, Lawrence Halprin, designed his sea-facing houses to blend seamlessly into the largely undisturbed landscape. And he set his whole development back from the water so that it would never contribute to coastal erosion. And yet, sea ranchers, most of whom drive up on weekends from places like San Francisco, have no real connection with the Pacific except visually, and that's the way Halprin planned it. The water is too cold for swimming. There's no harbor for fishing or sailing. The waters are beautiful, but they are completely alien, completely alien. A visitor wandering down to the shore from the Sea Ranch Lodge will, still today, I checked on this just this year, encounter a sign, strong sign saying, "Never turn your back on the ocean." And they mean it. It's like many signs around the coast today which tell you to stay away from the edge, showing often a figure falling over the edge into the sea. You've seen them. And that day, about a dozen years ago, this sign stopped me dead in my tracks on a bright afternoon. And I couldn't get it out of my mind for what seemed to be weeks thereafter. This sign is relatively new. I haven't been able to track its origins, but like the others that you have seen, it probably is no longer in the past than about 30 years in origin. But it tells us an enormous amount about our current orientation to the sea. The original inhabitants of Sea Ranch, the Pomo Indians, would never have needed such a warning, nor would their successors, the loggers and fishers of the coast. For they were as much sea as land people. This warning is for us landlubbers. It is both, as I came to recognize, a warning about the sea, but also an invitation to go back to the sea and try to reconstruct its history, but more important, to reconstruct our human relationship to the sea. Now, all around the world today, there's been a massive surge toward the sea. It's unprecedented in scale and rapidity, but it's one that stops at the line, the coastline, where land and sea meet. Half of all the globe's population now live within 100 miles of some ocean or another. In the United States, coastal populations have increased 30% in 30 years. And Sea Ranch has become the high-end symbol of what I've come to think of as the second great colonization of America. Actually, you could go back 15,000 years to the first, but that's rather long ago. That was by Asians coming across the land bridge and down the coast. But let's say this is the second great European or American colonization. The first was accomplished by those Europeans, those coastal and island Europeans who came by sea and were comfortable about it in the early modern period. But this time, the colonization originates from the interior and is pioneered by people who, even though they crowd the edge of the sea, regard it as something to be kept at bay, stay back from the sea. So there's a long history behind this, as you can imagine. Humans have had a very long and largely unrecorded and unconsidered history of living not only on, but with the shore. You'll see this distinction between on and with is very important to my narrative. It began roughly 165,000 years ago when, due to unfavorable internal conditions in Africa, climatic conditions, Africans came down to the sea on the southern tip of their continent to something we call today Pinnacle Point. And there they discovered an ecotone. Now, this is another key word for me. An ecotone is the place where two ecosystems overlapped and interact. In this case, the ecotone is made of water and of land, offering those who crossed the tide line there riches far beyond anything they could have found inland in Africa. Now, in what Carl Sauer later was to call the first homeland of mankind, Homo sapiens found a place, as he said, I love this phrase, so simple, to eat, to settle, to increase, and to learn. So this is a cultural moment as well as a biological and economic moment. In time, they came to be what ecologists call edge species, adept at exploiting both land and sea, and they learned not only to live on the sea, but with the sea. When Africans eventually exited their own continent, they did so by coastal migration, eventually settling the entire globe apart from Antarctica. Moving along shore rather than inland, humans remained coast huggers until the 19th century. That's a strong claim, but I think I can back it up. Coast huggers. When finally all the continents were settled, it was at the shore then that they developed, the Homo sapiens developed those qualities, including tool and symbol making, which gave them the distinctive species being that advantaged them over other earlier and sometimes even later hominids. As Rowan Jacobson has argued, I love this phrase, we are made for and made by that thin world where land meets sea. The shore was also the initial home of what we know now as Europeans, first in the Mediterranean and later along the northwestern edge, where people arrived as mobile hunter-gatherers, making their way alongshore, again longshore, in pursuit of prey, eventually settling estuaries and moving inland up rivers. Later, the coastal and island Europeans crossed the Atlantic, proceeding in the same exact way. Apart from the Spanish, who plunged inland in search of mineral riches, they came mainly, particularly out of northern Europe, as fishers, hunters, and traders, living lives not much different from the Native Americans they encountered on the far shore of the Atlantic. So, American history is usually told as Western movement, from sea to shining sea, when in fact, until the mid-19th century, it was more maritime than territorial. It will be remembered that Columbus set sail not with the intention of finding a new world, but an old one. His goal was passage to India, and he and those who followed him were frustrated to find a landmass blocking their way. And until the 19th century, explorers kept the hope alive that they would be able to cross somehow or go through this landmass which blocked their way. This produced, in the end, a vision of America, or initially at least, a vision of America as porous, the vision of an archipelagic America consisting of islands didn't die easily. For until the 19th century, basically, you look at geographies, world geographies, the whole world is conceived of islands. Some of them big, some of them small, but islands. And the notion of continents, which had sort of made its appearance in the 16th century as an idea, was not naturalized until the 18th century, when we Americans first came to see ourselves as continental, the Continental Army, the Continental Congress, and so on. So, the Europeans who explored North America, I'm talking about North America here, were island and coastal people who viewed the world in archipelagic terms. Try to get your head around that for a minute. Here they encountered people with the same meta-geography, the same maps in their heads. The natives of Virginia informed Captain John Smith, that the world was, quote, flat and round like a trencher, and themselves at its midst. The English, the French, and the Dutch empires were all seaborne and archipelagic. The English had been island hopping, first to Ireland, and then across the Atlantic, since the 15th century. Until the mid-17th century, the biggest economic prize for these northern Europeans continued to lie offshore in the fish-rich waters, I should say on the west coast, in the fur-rich otter territories, rather than on land as such. So North America was initially known entirely from the sea. You've got to start with that understanding. The interior remained terra incognita. And while the discovery of the coast was assumed to carry with it a claim to that hinterland, early explorers were far less interested in possessing land than passing through it to get to the other side. A map of 1651, sorry I don't have a PowerPoint with me, of Virginia shows it to be entirely insular. The map shows Drake's New Albion, California in other words, to be just beyond the outer edge of the Chesapeake. It's an amazing map, but that's what people believed. That western edge gave easy access to the Sea of China and the Indies. Wish fulfillment. In one of his first sermons, preached in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Robert Cushman gloried in the fact that Massachusetts appeared to be an island with access to the Far East, just on its western shore. God knows where that was, the Connecticut, perhaps, the Hudson, I don't know. At first, that which lay inland held little interest. Wilcom Washburn has pointed out that, quote, Europeans often overlooked or looked over the real land to which they came in anticipation of the Pacific that remained the ideal in their mind. And one of the first things, I love this is my great anecdote. One of the first things that the young Francis Billington did when he got off the Mayflower was to climb a tall tree with a westward view. And from there, he reported back seeing a great sea, as he thought. Well, it turned out to be only a pond, but if you go to Massachusetts today, you can still find the Billington Sea. It's still there, only it's pretty small. So I'm talking about the mental anticipations. Initially, what was to become the United States belonged more to sea than to land. And in 1837, Alexis de Tocqueville famously declared that America's destiny was to be maritime rather than continental. Water and the fish and the furs it yielded were to be its great resource. Also trade. Water connected them not only to their homelands in Europe, but to one another. The coast and its islands were North America's first frontier, not its You know, we have all kinds of frontiers in American history, but this one has been long overlooked. And this was a zone rather than a line. An ecotone constituted of both land and water with its own distinctive economy and culture. Initially explored and charted from the sea, the coasts were then, as Rachel Carson, the great Rachel Carson was later to describe them, an elusive and indefinable boundary. Try to find a coast when you're down there on the shore. It's very, very hard to do, particularly if the tides are running. These were waterlands inhabited by water people, both native and European, and connected to the interior by rivers. In an era when water provided the quickest and most efficient ways of travel, coastal and riverine frontiers were the most coveted and contested of all the geographies. And contrary to standard histories organized around settlement and Western movement, the first North American Europeans came with no territorial imperative, no desire particularly to settle. Like the fish and the animals that they were in search of, they never stayed in one place very long. The English, wrote Thoreau later, were like sailors who land but for a day. And the French and the Dutch were equally peripatetic, if that can apply to the sea. I'm not sure. That sounds like a landed word. Always on the move along shore rather than cross country. Down east, as they say in Maine, not out west. Down east is an old sailing direction. It now is a territory for tourist interest, but these people were more interested in sailing down east than they were going inland. So neither the east nor the west coast were initially conceived of as the edge of land, but rather as a unique space, a frontier, constantly moving landward and seaward simultaneously. Initially, shores were placeless places. This is a little hard to understand, but think about it. Placeless places, temporary camps for fishers and traders and hunters, whose dwellings were makeshift and portable, allowing periodic retreat when the winter came or the storms threatened. Like their native coastal dwellers, Europeans used the shores lightly. By the mid-17th century, the coasts were just beginning to be settled by a hybrid population of farmer fishers who were still oriented to the sea and the land simultaneously. For such amphibious people, the coast was not a line, not the edge or the barrier, but a place of transit and circulation. What was to become this country began as a gaggle of coastal enclaves tied together by the sea. When Virginia and Massachusetts colonists finally pushed inland in the early 17th century, their settlements remained quite dependent on the coast, linking more by water than by land, still tied closely to the shores around the Atlantic than to any of their hinterlands. The first American cities, as you probably know, were all seaports or river ports. Virginia survived only when it discovered a viable export crop, tobacco, and a labor supply, African slaves, that tied it ever more firmly to the sea rather than its interiors. Puritan farmers, lacking an export crop of their own, invested heavily in the fisheries as a crucial source of income to pay for their imports from England. To do so, they imported a body of West Country fishermen who constituted a coastal society quite distinct and economically and culturally from the agrarian Puritans themselves. In fact, there were enormous struggles between the Puritans and these, what they described as barbaric Anglican fishermen. As Samuel L. Morison put it in one of the great phrases ever written, God performed no miracle on New England soil, he gave the sea. I love that. Now, until the mid-19th century then, economic and political strength of the United States was bi-coastal rather than interior. It was a continental power, not because of overland prowess, but because of its maritime capacities. Like its eastern counterpoint, the West Coast, where I now live, was explored and settled largely by water. It was in search of safe harbors rather than arable lands that justified the possession of Oregon, what today we would call Washington and California. The West Coast was first prized as giving access to the Pacific, and for a long time it would remain more important as a way station than as a place to actually be. Thus, it was the sea, not land, that gave the United States its identity and shape in the early 19th century. Chinese fishermen felt it very much at home on the shores of San Francisco Bay, while Boston merchants made Monterey and then later Honolulu a little Boston. It's said, and I think it's true, that there was no more eastern place except for the East itself than Oregon in the early 19th century. Coastal societies had always been diasporic and cosmopolitan in nature, and still today they are more blue than red politically. Belonging exclusively neither to sea or to land, they were more open and permeable than the interiors, and coastal people were defined more by their roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, than by their roots, R-O-T-T-S. Sorry, I can't make that distinction verbally. Their roots in a particular place. One of the reasons that for centuries they have been regarded as somewhat alien by the inlanders. Somewhat alien. They are still regarded as incredibly alien. So it was not until the mid-19th century that Americans turned their backs on the sea and began to treat their coasts as a point of vulnerability rather than opportunity. And it was then that they began for the first time to arm the shores, establishing fixed points of immigration and transforming both the East and the West coasts from relatively open borderlands into strictly policed borders. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had defined itself as a continental nation that stretched from sea to shining sea, seizing islands, but never giving them, by the way, the equal status that they did with the contiguous continental acquisitions. This is one of the interesting things about American imperialism is its inability until very late to absorb islands as full status members. Having now become the hard edge of the land, coasts took on a very different meaning. Coastal communities lost their quasi-autonomous quality, becoming fully continental for the first time. And here, we historians had a role to play in all this, geographers too, because in the late 19th century, both geography and history became landlocked. It's an interesting story here having to do with Plymouth Rock, which I can't tell the full story of. But of course, Plymouth Rock today is seen as the starting point of American history. Thanks to the Civil War, it outmaneuvered and outlasted Jamestown in this category. They still fight over it, but that's okay. Plymouth Rock was never noted in the earlier colonial journals because it only became important over time. It was initially moved up the hill, split, and forgotten until the middle of the 19th century. And it was only until the 1880s that Plymouth Rock got reinstalled in a kind of sepulcher-like building to become the tourist destination that it is today. So this is an example of how the coast came to exemplify the beginnings and endings of American history. By the end of the 19th century, time's arrow moved east to west, no longer a longshore. And the East Coast became associated with the past, that is, of origins, and the West Coast with the future, graced by what Jonathan Rabin has nicely called the end of the world state of California. In the period roughly 1850 to 1970, America turned away from the sea, transforming its coasts and coastal islands into extensions of the land at best. This was due in part to the Industrial Revolution, which gave precedence to production over trade. The coasts were now linked to the interior by road and rail, and seaports themselves became connected and dependent on the deep interior and places all around the world. What happened in this late 19th century and early 20th century is the coastal trade precipitously declined, smaller ports decayed, and coastal and island populations also went into severe decline, leaving the shores to be recolonized by inland folk seeking not employment now, but leisure, pleasure rather than profit. So, in the late 19th century, as many of you may know, hotels and boarding houses encroached on the coast, filling the gaps like a toothless mouth of the decaying fishing towns. At first, these attracted only the very wealthy, but eventually in the automobile age, this would bring to the shore an urban and suburban populations. At first, this surge to the sea was mainly seasonal, mainly summer, or in the case of the South, winter. But today, more and more people are making it their permanent residence, especially in retirement. The urban industrial masses, though, found the shore a last frontier. All other frontiers had been closed to them, a new kind of open space to colonize during weekends and vacations. Henry David Thoreau had declared the sea in the mid-19th century to be a wilderness. And now the shore's promoters presented it as empty space, just like a wilderness, a refuge of nature, unsullied by industrial civilization. The old coastal communities suffered the fate not unlike the Native Americans, to which they were sometimes compared. They were doubly displaced, losing their place on the shore, but also becoming, in the minds of these newcomers, the last vestiges of a lost way of life, almost like lost tribes. Many a fishing village, which has long since lost its working waterfront, now becomes the object of nostalgia. A second shore, a shore of museums and antique shops and funny little restaurants with fishnet ceilings and all the rest. You've seen all this. I'm historicizing it. World War II had brought unprecedented militarization to America's coast, but in the age of intercontinental bombers and missiles, they ceased to be the country's first line of defense, opening up the shore to a new use, civilian use, nature preserves and the like. The real transformation, though, came really in the 1970s with the restructuring of the economy, the shifting of industrial production overseas, largely to Asia, and the changing of America's function from that of world's greatest industrial producer to the globe's greatest consumer nation. With the advent of the container ship, yes, and the supertanker, yes, world trade boomed and the sea took on an importance it hadn't had since the 19th century. That's the real development of the late 20th century. But commerce no longer flowed through the old seaports like New York and San Francisco, but now to a new set of mechanized terminals like Oakland and Bayonne. The shift to air travel accelerated the decline of old waterfronts, whose piers quickly rotted and seafaring populations virtually disappeared. And yet, it would not be until the 1980s, really, that the possibilities of this new empty space around the big cities like Manhattan and Boston and so on dawned on urban developers. Once it did, though, cities on the sea would be transformed beyond recognition. Today, the sailor towns are gone. Few who live in the new waterfront high-rises have any material connection to water at all, except their bottled water, I suggest. And for them, this was now entirely a space of leisure, a visual experience. They live on the coast, but have no experience with the ocean, except when storms and tsunamis bring it crashing into their otherwise wholly landed existence. The shock of the sea. So, for millions who live far from the coast, this is the most interesting part of all in some ways. The shores nevertheless occupy a prominent place in their mindscapes, in their imaginations. A lot of this paper is about how land and sea are imagined, and then how we act on imaginings, and how those imaginings affect our lives. Coasts are now a defining feature of national identity for almost all Americans, really. Treated as an inalienable heritage and precious natural resource to be defended against all enemies, natural and human. After Hurricane Camille in 1969, American flags were flying all over the Mississippi coast and deep inland. People responded to the Alaskan oil spill as if it happened in their own backyards. Think about it. Whole inland regions now identify with coasts, which are increasingly provide them with a collective identity they might otherwise not have. Maine touts its lobster coast, that's its logo. New Jersey, its shore, at least before Snooki. And California is defined by its beaches, which Kevin Starr calls the coast of dreams. People also have become possessive of their coasts for personal reasons, associating them with precious childhood memories, with youthful vitality, and with comfortable old age. I started my first contact with the sea at about the age of 4 in Atlantic City, when my parents took me there during the war. Now, to understand why people crowd the coast the way they do and imagine themselves so close to the coast, it is necessary to know that why we live on coasts, that we not only live on coasts, but we live by them mentally, as a mental and emotional resource. They are now closely associated with our desires, but also with our fears. And in recent years, Americans have come to identify with coasts more than any other geographical feature. Now, I'd love to get some pushback on this, so give it to me, but I will hold my ground, or should I say my water, on this one. They have become fiercely possessive of lighthouses, which have replaced church spires as regional symbols in New England and elsewhere. Lighthouses, which were once perceived as something to protect seafarers, are now seen as in need of protection themselves, everywhere threatened by coastal erosion. When sensible planners suggest in North Carolina that this tottering edifice should be moved back from the shore, locals denounce this as retreat. We're not going to retreat from the sea. Basic material on this kind of thing. Seaside property owners demand their inland taxpayers protect them from the sea, arguing that they are the trustees of a kind of national commons, even though all of you know they do everything they can to refuse access to the beaches that they regard wrongly as their own. Beaches have now become too often property, which doesn't even belong to the property owners. Coastal access is everywhere a major issue. As the value of shorefront property rises to astronomical levels, and those who build on the shore claim it as their own. Fishermen struggle to maintain shore rights against these developers, but so do surfers and divers. For the most part, the struggle over access is driven by reasons other than employment of a traditional kind. The coasts have now become a place of consumption rather than production. Now, this surge to the sea reflects a massive shift of leisure patterns, which have made the coast a site of a range of activities, swimming, pleasure sailing, diving, and surfing, that scarcely existed 2 centuries ago. But we also need to consider the existential functions of the coast for those who come to the beach to do nothing but to stare out at the sea. To do nothing. That's what most people do when they come to a beach. They do nothing. What's going on? They are there to be moved by the grandeur, thrilled by the power of the sublime, to be sure. Herman Melville puzzled over this in the mid-19th century when he noticed how many Manhattanites came down on weekends to stand on the waterfronts. He wrote, he found thousands upon thousands of mortal men fixed in ocean reveries. How then is this, he said? Are the green fields gone? What do they do here? And this is an interesting question. Think about it the next time you're at a beach or on the shore. What do they do here? What's going on? Melville would have been astonished about how many more Americans now come down to the sea simply to look. To answer Melville's interesting question, one must consider the place of the sea in American culture, where it figures as a final frontier, as a horizon, as a place, as a replacement for those green fields that have been lost to urban and suburban development. It is our wilderness, our only wilderness, really. The coasts are America's favorite place to dream. It is their horizon. But they are also visited by some of our worst collective nightmares. This is the interesting thing. Dream and nightmare coexist on coast. Close encounters with the land were always the mariner's worst fear. I mean, as a sailor, I know that the closer you get to shore, the more nervous you become. You don't sink in the middle of the ocean. You sink when you're at the shore. More shipwrecks are in harbors than any other place, by the way. But now, the terrors come not from the land to be approached, but from the sea itself. The hurricane, the shark attack, and now the tsunami. Jaws affected not just beachgoers, but people deep in America's heartland. Our seafaring nation has now become one of a seafaring one. It was actually a mental case that was written up after Jaws, after a young girl, I think it was in Kansas, saw Jaws and became obsessed that Jaws was going to arrive in her backyard, thousands of miles from the shore. But this is what I'm talking about, mental images. All right, now, I'm approaching the end. Few of our coasts are any longer pristine. Natural beaches have been replaced by artificial ones, and protective wetlands are long gone. Native species of fish, birds, and animals are largely endangered, but this is the point. So too is Homo littoralis, or in other words, coastal humanity. Few any longer make their living from the sea, and a working waterfront, if you can find one, is a rarity. There are 5,300 miles of Maine coastline, a deeply indented coastline, fractal coastline. Only 20 of those can now be described as functioning as a nexus between land and sea. Coves and headlands that were once home to active fishing and clamming communities are now lined with the residences of summer people. Everywhere, traces of the old coastal life are fading, even our best maritime museums are not very good at preserving the real memories of the coast. For example, in San Francisco's Hydeport Pier Museum, deep water ships are displayed, but very few of the small craft that actually were the key to life along the San Francisco Bay. And this plays into the romantic conceptions of the sea as a world apart, the kind of thing that you see in the Master and Commander films and elsewhere, ignoring the fact of the constant exchange between land and water that sustained coastal communities all around the world until very recently. Reconstructed sailor towns, and you can find some of these almost everywhere. There have been more maritime museums built in the last 30 years than any other form of museum. The impression is given that all those who lived in sailor towns were single unmarried males, when in fact, coastal work involved women as well as men who returned home at night, living lives that were deeply embedded in family and community and land. It was not until fishing became industrialized in the late 19th century that the ancient connection between fishing and farming was rent asunder, and the notion that this is a highly specialized and highly gendered occupation caused us to forget the unique hybrid nature of Homo littoralis, of coastal man and coastal woman, creatures that are all but distinct now in America and other developed countries and around the world generally. Earlier, coastal peoples knew how to live with the sea in a sustainable relationship with a challenging environment which gave them their living, but also frequently took from them their property and their lives. It's interesting, the attitudes toward death by these people is very different than landlubbers. They knew not to build close to the sea, but to erect the kind of temporary housing that could be shifted alongshore or inshore when necessity dictated. Coasts, however, are now the edge of land rather than the edge of sea. We no longer treat the shore as a thing with its life of its own, and this is crucial. A unique mix of land and water and an ecotonal zone. I've been stressing this all along. We have to look at this as a special place with special people. We attempt to pin it down, fix it in place, only to discover that it is the world's most recalcitrant geography. Today, a little more may belong to the sea, tomorrow a little less, Rachel Carson cautioned us. She's so right. The Japanese, who have armored 65% of their coasts, largely because of the huge concrete monopoly, were not protected from the 2011 tsunami by their gigantic seawalls. These not only prevented coastal residents from seeing what was coming straight at them, but modern harbor construction multiplied the force of the surge that wetlands and other natural features would have moderated and did moderate over generations. The fact that tsunami in Japanese means harbor wave suggests that by altering the coast, humans have had a hand in their own destruction. Well, should that be news to anybody? But it was news to the Japanese. Today, we are seeing even further extension of our continental limits through oil drilling, through the extension of the fishing limits, through all kinds of military adventures. Though the laws are coming, to treat the sea as if it were land, a territory to be subdued and exploited. I'm almost done. All around the world, wetlands have been destroyed with disastrous consequences. 97% in the United States, hardly less elsewhere. Recent events in the Gulf Coast show just how dangerous it is when water worlds are subordinated to interior interests. And it is our task as historians to reverse this coastal amnesia, to remind the public of just how central coasts have been to our human development. Now that the human impact on our coasts is far greater than it has ever been, we need to remind ourselves not just the extent to which humans have made coasts, but how coasts have made us. Right now, we are at a critical juncture in our evolution as a species. And, you can apply this in any kind of way, global climate change and so on, but this is one particular instance of it. If we ignore the part of ourselves that for millennia has been at home at the shore, we have lost an invaluable part of our own humanity. Is that big an issue? We can't afford to be alienated from the sea, for in doing so, we are alienated not only from nature. Now, this is an important point. A lot of environmentalists say, oh, we don't want to destroy nature. What we really don't want to destroy is human nature. And we're bound to do that as we expand this difference of the hard edge. So finally, here history can be an invaluable aid to recovery. You might even say salvation. If I sound too strident, I apologize. It can cure our current coastal amnesia by showing us how our ancestors lived well and lightly on those shores, how they knew how to build well back and move when the shores themselves moved. We can go back to the fishing techniques that sustained rather than destroyed ocean life. It's not that hard. We can reinvent aquacultures, such as the planting of oyster beds that not only provide food, but cleanse water and stabilize the shore. Compared to the costs that current practices are incurring, which are huge, billions, all of this can be done quite reasonably. But it will not happen until we stop turning our backs on the sea as something wild and alien and recognize it as the original home of mankind. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
John, could I ask a question, a preliminary question about what I think might be a parallel development? Being from Texas, I'm sure that I and others of the Texas contingent represent the third coast.
Yes.
But in Texas, and I'm sure elsewhere, the great preoccupation is with scarcity of water. In other words, where is the water going to come from? So you mentioned the great transformation in the latter part of the 20th century with the 1970s and the supercargoes and so on. But at the same time, don't we have an increasing awareness of the scarcity of our own water supplies? For example, in the movie Chinatown, the theme actually is the control of LA water. Would this be right to say that this is a parallel theme?
Well, it could be a parallel theme, and I heard a lecture quite recently on how little we know about soils and how much water is actually embedded in the land and the soil and under the soil. So yes, no, this is a critical question. I suppose the thirst will come first in the end, but boy, it's very parallel. It should be. We could use plenty of environmental histories of lakes, rivers, and so on to solve this problem. Yeah, thank you, Roger.
Floor is open. Jim?
John, you were implying throughout the talk that the American example that you emphasized was paralleled by the situation elsewhere. At least that's what I inferred. Is that correct? Or are there differences in other nation states in the way in which they have addressed the shore experience?
It's a very good question. I suppose I could make some fine distinctions between, for example, the way the Scandinavians have handled their shores. They've left them much more open. They don't define them as private property as we do. But I would say in the Western world and the developed non-Western worlds, these patterns are pretty comprehensive and pretty uniform. Because in effect, ocean policies, fishing policies in particular, are universal. And the big problem is to bring us back as ecologists to some sense of particularity and locality so that we can protect, for example, the fishermen off the Horn of Africa who have been turned to piracy by the fact that the big industrial fishing fleets have come and grabbed up all their sustenance. I mean, these are, we don't hear much about these people because they're weak and they're on decline, and they're sort of like the, you know, the Native Americans, the old Wild West. They're doomed to extinction, but there's no reason why we should concede the extinction of Homo littoralis. No way. But yeah, there's generalities and there are particulars. But yeah, please.
John,
Oh, thank you.
I think your distinction between zones, coastal zones, and coastal boundaries or lines is a very strong one and applies to rivers as well as oceans, the Hudson River, say, as opposed to the Mississippi. But I have to challenge the assertion that we are all coast huggers until the 19th century. There's a long way to make this argument. There's one sentence which would include the words horse, wheel, and origins of Indo-European, or there's just one line, Mongolians.
All right.
And it's certainly arguable that the peoples of the Mongolian peoples are the motive force in European and Asian history, and it has nothing to do with the coasts.
Well, we could battle this one out. Look, in this book, the Human Shore, I am deliberately setting up a counter-narrative, actually, to the biblical story of Eden, where the origins of mankind are seen as deeply inland. As it was said, there is no sea in Eden. And I'm making the proposition that we've been kind of led by the nose by a Middle Eastern mythology or set of mythologies, which came to take over Judaic and then Christian narratives. And this leaves out the story that I've been telling today, particularly its earlier episodes. It leaves out these people because they didn't tell a story. I mean, like all problems with historiography, the silenced don't get their day in the historian's court. And I'm saying we've had too much of the Eden narrative, too much of the desert narrative, and too little of the shore narrative. That's what. But we could battle this out. Yeah. I mean, I don't doubt that the horseman and the wagon and the wheel are enormously important, but I'm just trying to redress the balance a little bit. Try to find in the best global histories reference to coastal migration. Try to find this is interesting. Go back and look at prehistoric accounts and try to find accounts of coastal peoples, and there isn't much. Now, the reason so much is now emerging among archaeologists and anthropologists and the rest is wet archaeology, which for the first time, using the snorkel and the diving bell, have been able to go down and find these people or find evidence of those people at the near shore bottom of the sea. And this is revolutionizing, for example, the way we're looking at West Coast, the migration into America along the Bering and West Coast. And it's revolutionizing the concept of earliness in Northern Europe, of places like Orkney, where there's plenty of evidence. There's a new concept called the sea henge. Sea henge, which are underwater monuments, some of them preserved wood, but some of them stone, which suggest very highly sophisticated arrangements near the shore, now under the water. So all of this is grist for my mill anyway.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. You've convinced me that we need to sort of think about coastlines. My first question, which others I would have phrased a little differently, but I think they were the original questions. Are you positing the Northern European, North American experience to be unique, or are you putting it forward as a case study? Because as you know, I would my comparison, first comparison would be with South America and with the Caribbean, and certainly the experience in the Caribbean makes this island concept a very logical one for Europeans to have brought to mainland North America, but also putting at risk my total ignorance of Chinese history. The idea that was just brought up that much, actually, early European global history was not a coastal history. So I'm really, maybe putting it in a little bit different terms. But my other question came about with respect to this late 20th century trade as a reemergence of the importance of the sea. And actually what this does, what that helped to formulate to me was not necessarily a reemergence of the importance of the sea as much as perhaps a lessening of importance of the sea. And what I take away from your talk is this sort of dichotomization, where in some ways, with respect to human interaction with the natural world, the sea has become very, very important. But in terms of human interaction in daily events, such as trade, such as how you spend your weekend, in fact, the coast has become much more manageable and less important. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Okay, two points. I think my view is rather northern hemispheric, and I wouldn't want to tangle with you guys who do Latin America, and because that gets into the Spanish, and that they seem to be something of an exception to the thrust that I laid out today. Now, this question, you've raised up a very interesting question. Most maritime history has been a history of what happens on the surface of the sea. The kind of history I'm trying to do, which is more environmentally inflected, is to treat the sea not as something that we pass over or which we make history on, but that the sea should become part, an agent in that narrative. So I would say a couple things that won't satisfy, you can talk about it later, is that the more we apply an environmental approach to this, the more we'll get beneath the surface of things. We will begin to understand the complex relationships between landed peoples and the sea around us, as Rachel Carson tried so hard to suggest to us. Yet this is an interesting thing. Rachel Carson used the word immortal sea over and over and over again. As far as I know, she never acknowledged ultimately that the sea is not a timeless, eternal, immortal space, but rather is a mortal, historical, ever-changing place, which deserves to be incorporated into history, not to leave nature behind, but to meld a concept of nature and history together to make both more understandable and reliable guides. So yeah, I hope I've helped you answer that a little bit. It's all very complicated, but I hope in this book that I've given, it's a small book in the sense that one could spend 800, 1,000 pages on all these things, but I've tried. I really wanted to answer some questions for myself as a bi-coastal American, as an islander, a summer islander, and I've satisfied myself, so I'll leave it to others to judge whether I can satisfy them. But it's a shot. Yes, please.
John, as you know, I live on the shore too.
Yes,
half
a
the year.
Cape Codder. Yes.
And I just want to tell you a story which I think illustrates the complexity of what you're talking about. We were walking on the beach, as we want to do every summer, and we sat down on the beach about halfway to the one end of the bay that we were on, and somebody came along with a very official piece of paper and told us to leave, because that was his beach, and he had a piece of paper from the state of Massachusetts that made it very clear that we had no right to be there. Now, you can argue that two ways. You know, he was protecting his beach against, you know, the vile rabble. Or, as you said, no beach should be private. All beaches should be accessible to all. And it becomes a very complicated issue when you argue it the way you're arguing it, doesn't it? Do you understand what I'm suggesting?
Sure, I understand it. Yeah, I mean, look, there's a place on the west coast of Florida where the sands were eroding, as they always do when you put up seawalls. And the local owners, when they were asked, "Do you want us to replenish the beach?" They said, "No, because that'll bring people." In other words, that's a classic question, and there are arguments to be made on both sides. But I think maybe by understanding the shore and its history a little better, we could come to some resolutions of this. I don't like pristinity. I'm not one of those environmentalists who says we have to go back to something that as it was. Well, the fact is that we don't know what any of this was. We don't even have baselines for fisheries. We don't know how many fish there were in the sea, even 10 years ago. So we have to start with some, I would say, position that says that the sea has always been influenced by us and us by the sea. And let's start there and see if we can work out a viable relationship, rather than pushing it so far in one direction or another. Yeah.
Don, all the way in the back.
Thank you for all that. You really got me to thinking about a lot of things, but the quote from Melville I thought was fascinating about why are all those thousands of people down there on the shore? What are they so fixated about? Here's Melville, who was writing about his most famous character, was very fixated on something in the ocean, Moby Dick. But I'm wondering whether your last sentence was about the sea from which we all came. I'm wondering whether you're talking about from which we came geographically across the oceans, or from which we came as primitive creatures originally and evolved. Are you talking more biological determination or geographic determination?
I get off the boat at that point. No, I do not. No. Carson and others have shown, of course, that in the long evolution, we have all come from the sea, and we have the sea inside us, and all this kind of stuff. But as a historian, I really have to stop and pause for a minute. No, I look at this historically. Our historical relationship with the sea has been, I would describe it as amphibious. That is, early on, and I gave you the date, which is 165,000 years ago. That's not that long ago, actually. Homo sapiens began not only to harvest the sea, but the fish oils that they took in at that point may well have had some brain effects, which then are reflected in the fact that it's in those caves at Pinnacle Point that we find some of the first evidence ever of body painting. In other words, the symbolic capacity, the language capacity, if I can push it that far, of these people was superior to those, we'll probably find out there are predecessors to this, but it's a pretty impressive find by this man, Curtis Marion, in the caves at Pinnacle Point. And I think that's the kind of evidence that just, like the sign at Sea Ranch just set me back on my heels. And I had a Swedish, actually Danish microbiologist visiting us on Gotts Island. And I told him about my project, and he said, well, you've got to read this literature on the lipids and the fish oils and so on, because there's lots of evidence that this is an important nexus for human evolution. So I read that, and whew, so yeah, okay. Did I help answer that? I don't believe in this kind of deep ecology where we go beyond the sources. I'm just trying to track as far back as I can and as far to the present as I can this remarkable relationship, our remarkable relationship with the sea. But let me emphasize this again. I want to emphasize that the coast is a special place, an ecotone. And that's why I think I'm sort of, this sounds hubristic, but I think I'm discovering a kind of unknown land here, an uncharted land that we ought to pay a little more attention to, that's all.
Thank you, yeah. Jim? Jim, now that...
Jim and then Stanley?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I had a question about whether or not this project of yours is culturally bound to certain areas and not true of other areas. You mentioned that it's not true of South America, or you don't know.
Well, I wouldn't hazard it. Yeah.
But I'm wondering about China too.
Oh yeah, well,
and it seems to me that that's an awful lot of the world if you exclude those two places. And I'm wondering if maybe what you're really talking about is something in Western European culture that's been brought to the United States. And if that's true, what in the world is it? And where did it come from? Because it seems to me to be, if it is true that it's more or less limited to the world that grew up on Homer, not necessarily on Christianity, but on Homer.
Yeah, on Homer, yes.
I'm wondering if that doesn't tell us something about some certain kinds of cultural assumptions that lie at the heart of what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would accept all of that. This is a wet Western sieve, if you could put it that way. I start the book by saying Western civilization is landlocked, mentally, if not physically. While it has a long history of aquatic accomplishments, these don't constitute its primary identity. And yes, I'd love for some Chinese scholars to work on their coasts, which have, as far as I can tell, haven't been treated with all that due respect because of the image of the internal kingdom and so on. And I've looked into this in the Pacific. There's much more work on Pacific Islander culture, which is very, very interesting and counter to this narrative as well. So yes, it's a wet Western sieve, but I have to start somewhere, as you will understand, And I hope I've made a compelling case. Yeah.
Good.
Thank
We're
you, Jim.
Quickly running out of time, so
Stanley.
Oh yeah, hi. I have one observation and then a question. The observation is with regard to your your opening statement, the opening portion of the talk about the role of the coast in U.S. history. I immediately thought of that famous New Yorker cover,
yes.
the Steinberg
yes.
cover, where you have the two coasts and magnified, and then
Yeah.
the whole middle of the country is a sliver of land. You have that in your book,
Yeah,
of course.
it's here.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Don't
but
worry.
what I haven't heard in this talk that might be in your book is anything to do with military history. I thought immediately about the Spanish Armada, of course, and the role of shores in naval and military history in general, and how complicated that would make your case. And I wonder if you have thought about it or dealt with it in the book or.
Well, you're quite right, and Roger would have something to say about this. Coasts, in their military importance, have sort of ebbed and flowed, really. Interestingly enough, they become more important in the modern period, briefly. For example, during the Second World War, when Churchill declared that he was going to fight we will fight on the beaches, we'll fight in the hedgerows, and so on. You would not have found any medieval king saying that. They would have waited for those buggers to come inland and then chop them to bits. But you're quite right. The coast has become kind of, like it's become the red line often in modern history, where in earlier periods the red line was not that clearly drawn because it was not a coastline. And it's very, very difficult to recover the mental geographies of earlier periods when people did not think in these linear terms. So the answer is yes, it's variable and it changes and it depends partly on technology, but it also depends on perceived geographical boundedness and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, thank you, Stanley.
John, I have a question in a slightly different direction. I recently read a novel, and the theme of it is that climate change is a fiction. It's something that people talk about in English departments. With your historic sweep of all of these problems, what are we to make of climate change?
Oh, well, all right. Boy, oh boy. Well, the Wilson Center and the National History Center are still asking the big questions. That's good. No, I don't think, I stand with the vast majority of scientists, but for my particular purposes, I'm less frankly concerned with sea rise, although that's a factor, than with the warming and the changing weather patterns and the sea surges. I mean, we've already had some devastating effects. Whether you want to say that is human-induced climate change is an open question. But boy, there's no doubt what's that. I mean, you live on the Texas coast, near the Louisiana coast. We live on the Maine coast. We're visited with the same kind of fears and the same kind of anxieties. No, it's very real. It's very real. But there are things we can do about it. That's what, in the last part of my thing, I come back to this part of how smart our ancestors were in building houses that could be quickly torn down and moved. I've got a picture in this book of, on the Maine coast in Vinyl Haven, of somebody floating a schoolhouse on a schooner to place it in a new location. This happens all the time in Newfoundland. They wait till winter when they can sled their houses across bays to new and safer locations. We could do this. This is child's play. It's like picking up, it's like something that children play with in sandboxes. We could do this, and it could give people a lot more better place to live and a lot more security. But for all the reasons I think I started to spell out, this ain't going to happen very quickly.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. I think we're all indebted to John for an absolutely fascinating afternoon and a wonderful conversation. So let's give a round of applause, and I'll invite you to...
Thank you. Great stuff.
A little bit of wine and food back there. Thank you.
Good. No, I've sold my soul to this.
This was great.
You enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
very
we
much.
all.
I'm looking for a house on the coast right now.